Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out today. I want to say thank you to all the folks at the Newberry. Thank you to the Chicago Public Library and everyone who's been involved in the Confronting the Race Riots project. I want to talk today some about segregation and inequality and race in Chicago, particularly as it pertains to education. And I'm going to start before the 1919 race riot to say something about early African-American communities in the city, and hopefully by the end of my talk bring us up to the present before I pass things off to Jen Johnson to talk about continuing struggles in these areas. Oh, sorry, you may see us saying next because there's no clicker. Thank you. So prior, African Americans, people of African descent, have been in the area that is now the city of Chicago for a very long time, tracing back, as many people do, to DuSable, but also groups of fugitive slaves and freed people who constituted the city's initial black communities in the late 19th century. And I think it's important to know that formal legal segregation, to Lisa's point, formal legal segregation in the city didn't really end until the 1870s and 1880s, when a series of laws were passed that gave African Americans the right to vote in the state of Illinois, that ended school segregation by race by law, and then also passing laws passed against discrimination in public spaces. The thing about these laws is many of them were not enforced particularly well, but there also was a relatively small black community in the city. So by 1870, there were about, by 1890, there were about 15,000 people of African descent in the city, and by 1910, that number had grown to 40,000. And within this context, black children often during this late 19th century period, and even into the very early parts of the 20th century, often went to school with white children. The sort of very rigid, blocked-in segregation residentially that we see today was not as strictly enforced, and so people lived in different parts of the city to a greater extent. But certainly discrimination, particularly in employment and housing, was still rampant. Nonetheless, Chicago's black community developed a number of sort of different structures and internal structures, and particularly an emergence in the late 19th and early 20th century of a middle class and professional elite, some of whom are shown here on the slide. Go to the next. Certainly, the rise and the increase in the black population in the city for the 20th century can be directly taken back to the Great Migration. The Great Migration, by which African Americans from the South came to places all over the North, more than 7 million people between 1910 and 1970, and about 500,000 of those folks coming to Chicago eventually. In the period between World War I or the beginning of World War I and 1920, approximately 50,000 African American Southerners came to Chicago. And as the African American population grew, discrimination, segregation, and racial violence towards African Americans also increased. Certainly, as what's brought us here today is a commemoration of the 1919 race riots. This comes on the heels of the end of World War I, when soldiers and others are returning back to the city and to the United States more broadly, and you see an increased period of tensions around labor issues, tensions about residential segregation, leading up to the 1919 riot. The 1919 riot lasted between July 27th, 1919 and August 3rd, and it was part of a broader wave of similar race riots across the summer in what became known as the Red Summer of 1919. And I think while one of the things that's important to talk about here is I think often still there's a narrative that segregation in the North is imagined as less severe than in the South, less sort of upfront, less virulent, and certainly that wasn't the case. And for many migrants, this was an awakening to that as well. So increasingly after the period of the riots, part of what you see is the hardening of racial segregation. Racial segregation residentially becomes very much restricted to the Black Belt neighborhood on the south side, as well as some enclaves on the west side. And these restrictions were made by laws, by public policy, and by racial violence. And again, challenging this distinction that's sometimes still made between de facto and de jure segregation. During the 20th century, collaborations between the federal government, private interests, and the real estate industry contained African Americans in segregated residential communities by a number of different mechanisms. Things like restrictive covenants that restricted who could live in certain buildings, discriminatory public housing placement policies, white vigilante violence, redlining, and this is a redlining map here on the left-hand side. Yeah, your left. And which is a map of areas that the federal government, working with real estate interests, would determine what neighborhoods were viable for federally subsidized loans to get housing. And systematically, black communities were deemed non-applicable for this and were hence drawn in red. But I think it's important to put this in context and in conversation with other things that were being subsidized, particularly in the mid-20th century, that also increased and hardened segregation. Particularly here, I'm thinking about subsidizing white flight to the suburbs through things like highway construction, the GI Bill, federal subsidized loans that were often exclusionary or available in exclusionary white suburbs, so that there were investments being made both to maintain racial segregation in cities and in suburbs as exclusively white suburbs. Now, along with this residential segregation, certainly there were neighborhood policies about neighborhood attendance areas for schools. And I think often what we say is, okay, well, if there's residential segregation, then certainly there has to be schooling segregation as well. And that was true to some extent. But I think it's also important to note the ways that Chicago Public Schools policies exacerbated existing residential segregation and actually made schools more segregated by race than communities were. So some of the ways that that would be done would be policies like making it very difficult to transfer, building new schools in locations strategically to maintain segregation, and redrawing attendance areas. And this is an example of that. So these are a set of schools here on the west side. This is in the 1960s. And as you can see here, the attendance area for this particular school was gerrymandered to make sure that the schools further west, Spencer here and May, remained, if not all white, nearly all white, by expanding the area in which the Hefferon School District or neighborhood attendance boundary here to maintain that as an all-black school. I do want to say something, though, here about all-black spaces. I think sometimes there's a slippage where when we talk about all-black segregated spaces, there's a way in which that ends up mapping on to the ideas that black people do not or did not or continue to not value education, and that's certainly not the case. Black communities had very rich cultures around education and cultural practices, and these are just a few images from the 40s. One's a graduation ceremony at Farron Elementary School. Up at the top are a group of teens watching a football game at Phillips and Dunbar High Schools, two at the time predominantly black high schools in the city. And then at the bottom, a picture of the Bud Billiken Parade, a parade that has been going on now for almost 90 years, a parade that's whole purpose is to celebrate going back to school. Again, so just thinking about the ways in which there actually are very rich black cultural traditions around education. So for the majority of the first half of the 20th century, most of the efforts aimed at fixing the problems of inequitable education for black students were aimed at equalization, funding equalization, facilities equalization, more so than integration. There were other efforts as well, things like changing what was being taught in textbooks, getting rid of racist literature, children's literature, things that people were reading. But most of the bulk of this activity was around not so much desegregation, but equalization. So another mechanism that started to develop as black communities became more and more overcrowded and black schools became more and more overcrowded in the mid-20th century to maintain segregation was the creation of mobile classrooms. And these classrooms were deemed Willis Wagons because at the time Benjamin Willis was the superintendent of Chicago Public Schools. And these wagons were portable classrooms that were installed at overcrowded black schools to keep black students at those schools even when there were open seats at at nearby white schools that they were in close proximity to and could have attended. And so these sites, these Willis Wagons, became a major site of protest during the civil rights era here in Chicago. And literally, people, you can see here at the bottom left, parents getting down in front of bulldozers and construction equipment that was set to install these Willis Wagons as a form of protest. Up in the upper right-hand corner is a woman named Rosie Simpson. She was organizing folks in her community in Inglewood when they came and tried to create an all-mobile campus rather than allow students access to seats in nearby white schools with spaces open. And Ms. Simpson will be here later today. She's also featured in the 63 Boycott documentary that we'll be screening in a while, and she's a wonderful and fascinating person who I'm sure you'll have lots of questions for. So these neighborhood-based protests against Willis Wagons coalesced in 1963 into a citywide boycott that is the focus of the film 63 Boycott. And that this desegregation protest was about desegregation, but again, it was also about the right for Black students to have an equitable education and access to state resources. So in the film, one of the things you hear are people chanting, "What do we want books? When do we want them now?" And so I just want to stress here that desegregation wasn't centrally or even always first and foremost about Black and white students having cross-cultural interactions as much as it was about making demands on the rights to state resources. In 1963, the boycott that happened was for desegregation, but by the late 1960s, you see increasing pushes for community control. The school system remained segregated. It was not desegregated. Chicago Public Schools has never been comprehensively desegregated. And so communities increasingly were not asking for desegregation, but asking for increased resources for schools serving students of color, asking for self-determination, for more teachers of color, administrators of color, and that was happening in Black communities, and there was a major set of walkouts that happened in 1968 led by students for community control, for pushing for this self-determination. That same year, although at the time the Latinx population in Chicago was rather small, there was a protest at Harrison High School that's pictured up here on the left. So the picture on the top left is a student walkout at Harrison High School led by largely Mexican-American students asking for very similar things, but with the addition also of demands for bilingual education, for more Latinx teachers, et cetera. And then on the bottom is a set of walkouts from Austin High School on the west side that same year in '68. Between 1968 and the early 70s, there also were attempts at putting community control into place here in Chicago, and one of those was through the Woodlawn Experimental Schools Project, a project in Woodlawn led by Barbara Sizemore, a longtime public school principal and teacher who was a strong proponent of community control and worked with the Woodlawn organization and Chicago Public Schools in Woodlawn to try to implement this community control ideal for a number of years. As part of this project, they organized hundreds of parents into parent councils and did a lot of really interesting work. Eventually, the funding was cut off as they pushed perhaps what the district and the University of Chicago, who's also involved, thought too far into trying to have control over what happened in the community. During the same time, you see the flourishing of a number of independent Black institutions, schools that were built, education institutions that were built under the premise that Chicago Public Schools could never provide an equitable or anti-racist education for Black children. And so folks at the Institute of Positive Education on the south side, Shule Yawatoto on the west side, created independent Black schools as another way to try to address these issues. Again, not necessarily framed around segregation or desegregation as much as around Black self-determination. Some of the issues that you see Black schools facing in the 50s and 60s, you increasingly see also in Mexican-American schools here in Chicago as the decades proceed. And there was a major push in the early 1970s to create a new high school to serve Pilsen. So I mentioned Harrison and the walkouts that happened at Harrison in '68. That mobilization really spurred ongoing efforts to demand a new school, and the school that would eventually come out of these efforts was Benito Juarez High School. In the 1980s, there were a number of interesting efforts to reform Chicago public schools, certainly under Mayor Harold Washington. What came out of, not till after his death, the creation of local school councils as a very radical sort of democratic ideal of how to govern schools that gave particularly women and women of color more power within school buildings than they had had previously. Also the election of Jackie Vaughn as the first African-American, first woman, and first elementary school teacher to lead the Chicago Teachers Union. And throughout the period that I've been talking about today, black teachers in particular were extremely involved in the various efforts I've been discussing, as well as organizing for themselves, organizing against racist certification policies and additional testing, subjective testing that they had to endure, organizing for themselves as public sector workers, as well as organizing for the black communities that they served. So today there's a lot of discussion, and Jen certainly knows this, about the linkages between what teachers' teaching conditions being students' learning conditions. And that certainly was the core of the organizing by black teachers during the periods that I've been discussing. The other thing that happens in the 1980s, so we talk about segregation and desegregation, it was in 1980 that there finally was a desegregation consent decree here in the city of Chicago, 1980. By that point, white students made up less than 20% of the school population. And so again, desegregation, even as implemented by this federal order, was never comprehensive. But in fact, basically what it did is it took schools that were nearing or close to 100% white and made them have to be no more than 70% white. And that's what desegregation meant here in Chicago. In addition, it created some quotas and opportunities for more diversity and some desegregation actually in some of the most elite selective enrollment and magnet schools in the city. And that's probably where you saw the most impact of this desegregation consent decree, a decree that was taken out of place in 2009. Over the course of the period that I've been talking about, the student population changed dramatically demographically here in the city. You saw the growth of Latinx students here in Chicago, a decline in the number of black students in Chicago, and that decline is not something of sort of like a naturally occurring phenomenon, but in fact a push out of public policies that have increasingly pushed black folks and low-income people more generally out of the city of Chicago. And a dramatic decrease in the white population in Chicago public schools. So our more recent era of reform, people discuss as a sort of corporate era of reform since mayoral control of schooling in 1995 by Mayor Richard M. Daley, in which business leaders, a sort of corporate logic, the policies and politics of austerity have come in to govern a public entity, increases in privatization in public education. And that's had a really particularly detrimental effect on black communities here in the city. On the one hand, I think that's important if we think about things organizationally. So many of the sort of efforts that I've discussed were led by parents and teachers and community members, students from the communities most impacted. And in this corporate turn in education reform, those folks aren't seen as experts on very much of anything. And instead, leaders in the business world or people who operate by a business logic are seen as the leaders of this moment. Philanthropists here like the Gates Foundation and others. But the other thing that you've seen over this period of time, and Jen will talk more about this, so I won't get too much into it, is the dramatic decline in black teachers, as well as an increase in school closings that have overwhelmingly impacted black communities here in the city. And so this map here, which is from the '63 boycott film, shows the schools that were closed in 2013 when the massive wave of 50 at once were closed. And I think it's important to note that of those 50 schools, 70% of those schools had both majority black teacher and black student populations. And so when these schools are closed, black children are losing neighborhood schools and black teachers are often losing their jobs. So certainly this turn has had a big deal and a big impact on that trend. But I want to leave on a happy note that will hopefully segue well into Jen's comments for us today, is that, you know, if anything, Chicago is an organizing city. And I hope that one of the things you take out of this is that there's this long and rich organizing tradition, not just against segregation in education, but against racial inequity in education and other areas of life here in the city, and that these efforts continue. They continue with coalitional groups of teachers, of students, of young people in particular, who have often been more recently at the forefront of these efforts to push for more equitable educational system here in the city. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to let Jen come up, and then I look forward to us being in conversation, but really to hearing from you all as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today. Not only is Elizabeth someone who I look up to and admire, but she's become a friend and colleague, and so it's exciting to participate with her. And also, I just want to say Newberry Library has been incredibly instrumental in my growth as an educator. I can say that my teacher preparation was not adequate, and we need to do something about that. And Newberry actually was instrumental in helping me become a better history teacher. So today, you can go to the next slide, I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about my take on what does school segregation look like in CPS in kind of the current era, and then therefore, what are the implications? What does that mean for the experiences of students and teachers? What does that mean for the organizing work that we need to do in terms of education justice? And what does that mean instruction should actually look like? I was a teacher for 10 years at Lincoln Park High School, and that hopefully will come up a little bit later. It's one of few Chicago public schools that has a truly mixed student body in terms of race. That's a rare experience, as we'll talk about today. So Elizabeth already quoted current CEO Janice Jackson of Chicago Public Schools, who said that segregation was a part of our history and it's not a CPS issue. The previous CEO, Barbara Byrd Bennett, well, not the previous one to that, right? There have been like 7 in the last few years. She said that the school closings were not racist in 2013, but we've seen that there's a pattern, right? There's been a pattern over time that is pretty undeniable, and it remains true in the present day. So if we go to the next slide, this is from research done by my colleagues, Pavlin Jankov and Carol Cariff, who wrote in the Education Journal about intense segregation in Chicago public schools. You'll see the row on the bottom is the oldest row from 1981, and the row on top is the most recent one, just prior to the school closings in 2013. The bands show where black students are concentrated, and in the lower bands, black students are spread out in a wider array of schools, in schools where there may be more white students or less poverty. If you notice, though, the bar that says 60% at the top in 2012 indicates that 60% of black students in 2012 were in schools that were at least 90% black and 90% free and reduced lunch, so high poverty. So when the consent decree went away, right, it exacerbated a resegregation of the schools, although, as Elizabeth said, we've never truly desegregated. And this is also true for Latinx students. In 2017, that's more recent, right? 2/3 of black students were still in intensely segregated schools, and that was true for 40% of Latinx students. So it's affecting all of our students. And we do know that Chicago Public Schools is predominantly black and Latinx. Not only have school closings contributed to school segregation, but so has charter school proliferation. So this graph shows both school actions, which are the little black triangles, and those are mostly the school closings. And you can see those take place in the darker blue neighborhoods, the black neighborhoods much more frequently. And then the little white circles represent charter school proliferation. So part of the issue with resegregation or continued segregation in our schools is this privatization project, right? When Arne Duncan was CEO in the early 2000s, before he became Secretary of Education, he argued for the closing of 100 neighborhood schools, and he called it Renaissance 2010. So it was a renaissance to close 100 neighborhood schools in order to open 100 charter schools. These charter schools remain even more intensely segregated than existing Chicago public schools. Because of the networks, because of where they're located, they tend to serve very heavily black student populations or Latinx student populations. I won't belabor the point, but I'll add a little bit to this discussion of the school closings in 2013. You can see the black dots on the right side of the screen indicate schools that were nearly 100% black, and the majority of the schools that were closed, right, the black dots, are towards that side of the graph. What you see, though, in here are these little white dots are the other schools that Chicago Public Schools said were eligible to be closed in 2013, right? So there's this guise that the process is actually equitable because there's all of these schools across the spectrum of race and enrollment that are eligible to be closed, right? It's not racist. But in the end, the actual policy, the actual closing, was disproportionately affecting Black communities, as we've already seen. So there's a way in which policy has been framed in order to try to remove this idea that we're not actually disproportionately impacting communities of color, and particularly Black communities. We've already seen a little bit about this, so I don't want to belabor it again, but over time, as the consent decree went away, we've seen the number of schools that actually have 0 or 1 Black teacher rise. So if you look at the number 145, in 2012, 145 schools had less than 10% Black teachers and students, right? Today, the number sits around 130, and there's similar numbers for Latinx schools. So we're seeing fewer students have experiences with other races of students and races of teachers. This is a graph showing non-Black students, so students of other races, and the experiences that they have with Black teachers. And so in 1989, when the consent decree was still in effect, there were a large number of non-Black students who might have Black teachers. And as time has gone by, they're having less and less of those experiences. And research shows not only that Black teachers are critical in the experiences of Black students and their achievement, but it's actually critical for all students, right, to see a role model be a Black teacher in front of them. When I taught at Lincoln Park High School, I started in 2003. There were over a dozen Black teachers on a staff of 125, so that's still not even that great, right? But when I left in 2013 to work at the CTU, there were less than 5 of us. That's a problem, particularly at a school that is racially diverse, where they see student diversity. They were not really seeing teacher diversity. And as was mentioned, similar problems are occurring in recent years at selective enrollment schools. So this graph shows some of our most prominent and popular selective enrollment schools: Jones, Lane Tech, Northside, Peyton, and Whitney Young. And as you can see, the lines for the number of Black students, right, which is the blue line, has declined increasingly over time. And if we drew the line for 2009, when the consent decree lapsed, we'll see that that's when there's definitely a significant fall off. There's been some trends, right, positive for Latinx students, and we'll talk a little bit about that with teachers in a second as well. So what has this meant? Like, what are the implications? Well, in schools where we have at least 90% Black students, we have high rates of exclusionary discipline, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, punishment, right? Chicago Public Schools currently also staffs 2 Chicago police officers in most neighborhood high schools. And so there's actually a direct link to be able to arrest students. And when our population of students is predominantly Black and Latinx, that means that students of color are being funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline. In schools that are less than 10% Black, right, discipline is much lower. And there's a similar trend for Latinx students, though it's not as severe. And so we need to really think about what, in particular, anti-Blackness means in our schools today. So this is the demographic information for Chicago Public Schools for this school year. On the left-hand side is the demographics of students. You can see that the Latinx population is growing dramatically. It's nearly 50% of our students are Latinx. Elizabeth mentioned the fight over decades for bilingual education. That continues to this day. Piccolo Elementary School had a half-time bilingual coordinator this school year, and CPS just cut that bilingual coordinator, and the school is predominantly Latinx and has bilingual needs. So why is this happening, right? Why is this scarcity happening? And one would have to say, like, when you have a population of students that is nearly 90% Black and Latinx, there's really not a political will. The population of white students is down to, I think, 10%. But then you look at the teacher graph. Today, right, the shift of the firing of Black teachers over time means that 50% of our teachers in Chicago Public Schools are white. And believe me, I work with excellent educators of all different stripes, but we have to understand racial politics and racism are real. And this means that teachers have to do a heck of a lot of extra work in order to combat these systems that are set up for them to maybe not address these concerns. Do any of you guys listen to Vocalo radio? It's a pretty great station. So there's a poet, a young man who speaks in one of these little Segway sound bites, and he says, you know, when I went to elementary school, I was in an all-black neighborhood. I was in an all-black school. And then he came to Lincoln Park High School, and it was his first experience with people of different backgrounds. And that was recent years, right? This is still happening. And so our educators need to be a part of this shift in challenging policy and understanding what their own identities mean in the classrooms where they teach every day. So I asked my colleague, Sarah Rothschild, who's another one of our researchers, to do a little analysis for me this week, and she's amazing, and she makes fabulous maps. So she took a look at educator residency, and this is a thing that comes up all the time among teachers. There is a residency policy, right? Chicago Public Schools teachers must live in the city of Chicago. There are some exceptions. There are waivers for special education, particularly hard to staff positions, but the vast majority of teachers must live in Chicago proper. And so the little orange dots represent the community areas in the city, right? There's 77 community areas where 45% of our educators live. And let me just say, this is based on all of our educators that are CTU members, so this includes paraprofessionals. And let me tell you, paraprofessionals, the heart and soul of our schools, clerks, teacher assistants, are almost all Latinx and Black. So this is skewed. Teachers, right, are trending much more white. So 45% of educators are living, you guys know the city, right? Living mostly north. A few in kind of the southwestern areas like Mount Greenwood, Beverly, right? And then the blue squares are areas in which maybe less than 0.5% each of our educators live. So even though there's a whole bunch of those blue squares only represent 4% of educators where they live. Clearly, they don't all live then and work in a school in the community where they live, right? They're traveling for work. And to be honest, students do too. Even though we have a segregated system, I think it's almost like 45% of elementary school students do not go to their neighborhood public school, and something closer to 70% of high school students don't go to their neighborhood high school. So we've got like a ton of motion happening, people traveling and crossing lines, and yet students still remain in segregated schools, right? And teachers in some ways are also segregated, but they're more segregated actually where they live in some ways than where they work. So I always tell people, I don't want to lift the residency requirement. I think we should live in the city, right? Because at least we're maybe slightly closer to the communities where our students actually live every day. So what are we doing about this? Obviously, I'm biased. I work for the Chicago Teachers Union. I believe one aspect of what we're doing is fighting for a fair contract. This right-hand corner represents an image from a report that we put out, and we've put it out twice, and I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. It's at the CTU's website, ctulocal1.org, and it's called The Schools Chicago's Students Deserve. We know we're not going to win everything we need in a contract, but this outlines our educational platform. What are we fighting for? And it's sad, but it's the same things that were being fought for in 1963 are being fought for to this day. We can't have conversations about integration when we don't have basic necessities. Currently, there are 120 schools that have a full-time librarian. 120 schools that have a full-time librarian. Anybody know how many Chicago public schools there are? Want to take a guess? 500. So 120 full-time librarians for 500 schools. Take a guess, based on what we've talked today, about where librarians are likely to be staffed. They're much more concentrated on the north side. There are parts of the south side where there is no library that is open in a school and absolutely no librarian. So we're still focusing on equity of resources to this day. We also have to recognize, because of the racial segregation, that we have to have the mindset of being anti-racist in our policy and our practice. And so CTU has been a part of Black Lives Matters at School Week the last few years. It's a national movement to try to bring this kind of awareness into our school buildings. And we're very involved in the anti-gang database work that's been happening, which profiles predominantly, but not exclusively, right, Latinx and Black young people and older folks. and talking about what sanctuary looks like, right? How do the national kind of dialogues and horribly racist policies actually trickle down to the local level, right? We've had students and teachers and parents deported from our city, even though we're a welcoming city. So in terms of teaching, right, this is where I get a little more comfortable because I was a classroom teacher. I still have a license. I'm ready to teach kids tomorrow. Just give me a classroom. We have to talk about what our pedagogical frameworks and mindset are as educators, particularly when 50% of educators in CPS are white. So Gloria Ladson-Billings, an incredibly important Black scholar who's still working to this day in education, came up with this frame called culturally relevant curriculum in the 1990s. And she says that every educator needs to think of their work in this triangle. We cannot properly achieve academic success with our students if we are not building critical consciousness among those students. Students must know the power dynamics that are at play, be able to question them, understand how they are operating in them and how they're being operated on. And to that other point, teachers must have cultural competency. They must seek to understand the lived experiences and identities of their students, particularly when there's a mismatch, right? I may be a Black teacher, but I'm from Michigan, you guys. I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I did not grow up in the city of Chicago. I can only have so much in common with my students, so it's on me to know what is going on with them and how do I best relate to them, what are their needs, and not to impose just what I think needs to be taught every day. Along with that, I have another colleague, Walter Taylor, who does professional development for our union members. He's started to talk about how restorative justice plays into critical race theory and culturally relevant curriculum. So have you heard of restorative justice? Right? It's a practice that we talk about in the anti-incarceration movement, right? But we also talk about it in schools. It's the notion that harm is constantly being done, and instead of punishment, we need to look to heal the harm, right? Deal with the actual premises that are causing the problems. And we also have to have this undergirding of anti-racist practice. So Walter says you cannot do restorative justice practice in schools properly if you do not approach it from a critical race lens. You must understand that white supremacy is operating in schools, and if your restorative justice practices are not attached to a criticism of white supremacy, then you're just gonna reinforce the same problems that we already saw with exclusionary discipline. You can't just set up a peace circle and say, oh, everything's great, right? If you're not actually looking at, well, as a white teacher who's been there maybe a couple years, is from doesn't come from the city, right? All Black student population. We have to unpack these things. There's also a lot of thinking going on around trauma-informed or healing-centered pedagogy, right? Not punishment. And then again, the connection to cultural competency. So I want to close with a few ideas in terms of educating our students in the classroom based on our local history here in Chicago. And one of the ways that I think is the most powerful to help students unpack these dynamics is through teaching memorialization. And we have so many rich examples in this city. The Wall of Respect that was painted on the South Side in the 1960s for a few years was an homage to Black leaders. It no longer exists. What does that mean when a mural that was honoring your heroes is removed, right? Similar to when schools named after Black heroes were closed, right? We have a mural from Casa Atlan, one of the most important community centers in Pilsen. We did some of our union organizing work there. When it was sold to a condo association, the mural was whitewashed, and the community said, that's not okay. Ray Potlan needs to be able to put his mural back up, and they fought for it to be put back up. This idea of recognizing and memorializing community. The Bronzeville statue of Gwendolyn Brooks and Kenwood was just put in place in 2018. It's the first public memorial to Gwendolyn Brooks, poet laureate of the city of Chicago. And then there's a current project in the works that the city has not promised to fund, which is really important for people in this room to know. This is the design that was selected through the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project to honor the survivors of the Burge police torture from the 1970s through the 1990s. The city passed an ordinance in 2015 requiring curriculum to be taught in the schools about the torture, a center for counseling to be open, which is open, that's amazing, and among other things, a memorial that has yet to be built. The city needs to come through with the funds and memorialize it. How amazing for students, right, to be able to walk through this space, right, to understand the history. And then the last project I'll plug on the top right, there's a professor at Western Illinois University that Elizabeth and I have met named Peter Cole, who thought it would be vital for us to memorialize the victims of the 1919 race riot. And so a small coalition of us have been working together to try to raise funds in order to think about how could we actually honor those 38 victims. This photo is from the Schloperstein Project, which memorializes victims of the Holocaust across Europe, and these stones are literally in the street, and so you just come upon them. What if students were a part of a project designing a memorial to the victims of the race riots? What if they were doing research on these victims? We have a database, we know who these people are. What if they were involved? As a teacher myself, I relied a lot on primary sources. I see Lisa Oppenheim's in the room from Chicago History Fair. I was a History Fair educator. This is a critical way for teachers in the classroom to allow their students to do inquiry into the history of our city. There's always projects on the race riots of 1919 because it was so seminal, and our students don't often get taught about it. They have to learn about it themselves. I'll point out Jacob Lawrence's paintings, right? Prolific black painter, painted the Migration series. I often use those in my classroom to teach the race riots. And then I'm excited that Eve Ewing's new book, right, which really should be dovetailed in a companion piece in some ways to her book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard. Her book on 1919 with poetry is coming out soon. That would be a perfect thing for students to read, right, to connect to the history of their city. And then I think we've really got to think of ourselves in terms of being educators as curators of critical experiences, facilitators of skill development, and empowerers of agency. So school shouldn't just be about primary sources, right, and going back, but it should be looking at the present. So I did a community mapping project with my students where they looked not at just the problems in community, which we can oversaturate ourselves with, but mapping assets. What is vital in your community? What are the exciting parts of your community? And I think this is really a way to connect to the race riots of 1919 because you can examine policies that limited assets, right? But also you can be looking for those, the roses growing in concrete, as we so often say. The 1963 boycott filmmakers also have done a good job of trying to memorialize testimonials, right, of participants of the boycott. What if our students were doing more oral history projects, interviewing their family members, interviewing fellow Chicagoans? I'm from Michigan, and my family hails from Alabama. But almost always, my students who were black in the schools said their family came from Arkansas or Mississippi. How, right? Have our students connect with their past and create documentaries themselves, right? Documenting the history of migration in their own families. So I'll close with a project that was not mine, so you can go to the next slide, but was of a colleague, and a few folks in this room know her. Her name is Tamala Chambers. She's now a Chicago public librarian, and she's a former Chicago public school teacher. She taught at Chicago Vocational Career Academy. She and I were in the same professional development through Newberry, right? Great stuff. And we learned about the Afro-Cobra art movement of the 1960s, and she connected with a local artist. She had her students study primary source research on the race riots of 1919. She had them study the Afro-Cobra art movement, and then students design their own protest art with whatever messages they chose, and then she got a permit to actually display the students' art near the 21st Street Beach. This is 2 years ago, near the spot where Eugene Williams was killed, where the race riots began. There's a video of this project on Vimeo called Looking Back to Look Forward, if you want to look it up. On the right, I went to the performance. She had her students perform poetry, music, on the beach. It was a beautiful day. It was incredible. And the artist that they worked with actually sculpted. Do you see there's the boy sitting down on the stage with a white tank top? That's not a real person. That's a sculpture. She worked with an artist who sculpted this boy based on one of her students. So it looks like one of her actual students in the class. But the idea was that was Eugene Williams sitting with them on the stage as they did this performance. Like, this project just blows my mind every time I talk about it and think about it. This is what education should look like. This is what history education should look like. And I'll just close, that's an optimistic part, but a sad thing happened immediately after this exhibit. they left the artwork up for a couple weeks, right? They had a permit to do so. And a few days after this performance, the sculpture of the young man was, I don't know what the best way to say it, like desecrated. Someone came and lopped the head off. So like, we've got a lot of work to do, right? But great things are possible, especially when we empower our young people to really understand the history, the power dynamics, and racism that is very real in our city's history. Thank you.
Thank you for those presentations. I should note, too, that the CPS teacher who worked with her student to make that sculpture of Eugene Williams was on a fellowship at the Newberry when she was working on that project. It's amazing how that all comes together. Charity White, really extraordinary teacher. And someone needs to tell that story, too. I'm glad you, traced the outlines of that. I just want to get out of the way. There are probably a lot of questions from the audience. I have plenty of questions, but I just want to mine the expertise in the room as well. So I think we'll go ahead and just start with questions from the audience. Brad, if you want to put up the Mentimeter, and we're going to step you through how to get some of these questions up on the screen. So go to www.menti.com. That's the first step. If you get out your phone, I see some of you doing this, right? And use the code 630289. Type in your question, and it'll come up here on the screen, and we can get a sense of the kinds of questions that are in your in the audience. So you'll want to go to your browser, obviously, open up Safari or Firefox or whatever it is that you have. Okay, good. Here they go. Let's take a look at some of these questions. Are Afrocentric schools and curriculum one solution to the issues around equal, resourceful, and representative education for Black students, as it challenges the Eurocentric nature of American public schools? Are there any specific public school systems Chicago looks to for ideas and solutions to create a more equitable education for all? How can citizens of Chicago best engage with the work of the CTU? How can educators and researchers combat the charter school propaganda that targets the Latinx and African American communities with flawed data of 100% graduation and college acceptance? Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Do you guys want to take on one of those questions to begin?
Hello?
Great.
Hello. So I'll address the question that was asking about sort of Afrocentric or African-centered education, because I touched on it in passing. But there were a number of schools, and there still remain schools that are operated as independent African-centered schools. I would say one of the things that they constantly have had difficulty with is funding and being sustainable. As part of their mission, they want to serve some of the most vulnerable students who families don't have a lot of resources within their communities. And so having to have some type of tuition to keep the lights on and pay their teachers while still trying to be open to as many students as possible actually made a number of the schools eventually go under that started in the 60s and were closed by the 80s. Some have persisted, and of those, interestingly, and kind of related to this question of charter schools, a number of them did enter the charter school space. And it's been interesting to see the tensions around that, because within the broader African-centered school community and independent Black school community more generally, there was conflict over whether schools, African-centered schools or Black independent institutions could still call themselves independent if they went into if they became charter schools. I'd also note that I think it's interesting, just around these issues of school closings and sort of a way in which perhaps it's sometimes a bit more nuanced. I think often when we think of charter schools, we think of the large sort of franchises, or corporate networks. But a number of these African-centered schools really kind of started off as sort of more mom and pop shops. And interestingly, they've often been the ones who, in other places, not just Chicago, that have been targeted for closing. And I remember this particularly around Barbara Sizemore Academy, which was one of initially sort of came out of the Institute of Positive Education schools that they were creating in the 60s. They had a long-running independent school and then became a charter school as the Betty Shabazz charter school network, and Barbara Sizemore School was slated for closing. And I remember one of the things that struck me is the school talked about how the students that they served 2/3, I think it was, of those students had come from schools that had closed. And it was striking to me that this was an issue that brought up the fact that these are interrelated issues, particularly happening within African American communities around the closing of traditional public schools and issues and problems within the charter school sector as well.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback a little bit on that. They're on top of it, but yeah, it's tricky. That we wouldn't necessarily have the need for these kinds of independent, private, or charter schools if we were doing what we needed to do in the public schools, right? If we were funding our public schools equitably, if we were doing student-centered, culturally relevant curriculum in our schools, right? If we were allowing community, parents, and students self-determination to make decisions in our public schools, people wouldn't feel the need to have to do something separate. And we at CTU are not opposed to people doing what is right for their community, right? But when charter schools are pitted against, right, public schools because they don't get what they need, therein lies the problem. But what if we had Afrocentric Chicago public schools, because that's what the community wanted? And we've had experiments with that, but we ought to have real community control in our schools.
There are a couple themes coming up in the questions here. One has to do with Chicago versus the national struggle, how Chicago compares, or what models Chicago might look to. And I think, secondly, a few questions that are focused also on the student experience or student involvement, or what students can do, and how these problems, I think, also, if we recenter the conversation towards the student experience, what kind of stories are we telling there? Maybe you guys could speak to those questions.
Yeah.
I'll start by talking about the issue of how sort of Chicago fits within a larger national narrative. And I think Chicago has long been a place that's been looked to, particularly for the city's grassroots organizing traditions and this long tradition and history of struggle and protest. I mentioned the 1963 boycott that the film focuses on, that's going to be screened here later this afternoon. That boycott and the fact that Chicago was able to mobilize and mass mobilize on such a level is part of the reason why in 1965 and 1966, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin Luther King decided that Chicago was the place that they wanted to come to test out their nonviolent approaches here in the city. In subsequent eras, Chicago's been a model for a number of different reform efforts. During the late 80s and into the early 90s, the creation of local school councils made Chicago a model nationally for what a radical democratic administration of public schooling might look like. And then again, very quickly on the heels of that, by the mid-90s to late 90s, Chicago was being looked at as a model nationally for a corporate style of education reform. I think to draw some on the work that the Chicago Teachers Union has done, parent groups, community groups, particularly since the early 2000s, fighting back against privatization of public education, really going to this model of a teachers union embracing a social justice mission that pairs with community groups, works with and empowers and promotes and elevates the work already going on in communities. That model has been something that's been taken up across the country. So in this recent wave of Red for Ed protests that you've seen across the country, many of them have looked to Chicago or have direct connections to folks in Chicago for that work. So I think Chicago has been and continues to be a place that's generated really powerful social movements, as well as some really powerful sort of top-down political policies as well. And the tension between those two is something that continues to animate the politics of the city, and has had implications nationally as well in terms of policy and folks coming out of the city and going to the national level. You mentioned Arne Duncan, et cetera.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's like a model school district, right, that's getting all of this right, unfortunately. If you look at the public school comparative cities around the country, like the biggest cities, we're all struggling with the same issues. There are different states that are doing better, though, with school funding, right? We've, in the last decade, been looking a lot at Minnesota's progressive education funding, although the community groups had to fight for that, right? There's a collaboration across religious groups, labor groups, educators called Minnesotans for a Fair Economy, and they fought to get legislative change in order to fund public schools and other public institutions. I will say that the community school model is something that has a hold here in Chicago, but is a national movement, and what we're trying to do here in CPS is capitalize on it. have people heard of community schools before? This idea that they're open longer during the evening, right? That they have programs for parents and community is wonderful. However, you can kind of get stuck with just providing services and programs, and that doesn't get us to that transformative space where parents, teachers, and students are collaboratively leading schools. And so we won in our last contract 20 what we're calling sustainable community schools, where a lead partner, community nonprofit, works directly with the school, and they should have a leadership team representing different stakeholders, making decisions about how funds, programs are spent in the building. And so I think we should be looking towards that kind of community school model through equitable funding. And thankfully, the state of Illinois just passed the new evidence-based model. Now it's about getting the revenue into the model, right? The state now acknowledges that school districts that have higher special education populations, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of bilingual students need more resources, but we need the tax dollars, right, to fund that.
Can I say something also just about the student,
great.
sort of student-centered and student-based part? So in my historical work, there are lots of examples you see of students really leading the way around these education issues. I spoke about these student-led walkouts, and particularly at Harrison High School by both Black and Latinx students in 1968. And a number of the demands made by Black students who were walking out in 1968 were actually accommodated. So you saw a rise in the number of Black principals and administrators, the firing of some principals who were deemed racist by students. And so even more so, I think, than the demands made by the 63 boycott that children were involved in, but was really an adult-led movement and moment, those 1968 student-led boycotts did, bear some fruit. I'd say in a sort of more, and I find teaching that history to be very powerful and empowering for students. One of the things that I've been able to do since I wrote this book is give a lot of talks to different audiences, including young people. And I remember I gave a talk and was having a conversation with high school students in a social studies class, and they were really interested in this long history of student protest in the city, and part of what came out of that was them making their own demands on the administration at their school for things that they wanted. They ended up organizing a mayoral forum to be hosted at their school when previously there wasn't one scheduled to be one, as a result of thinking more in depth about sort of the history of those on whom they were standing. And the other thing I would say is I think even in our current moment, you see young people leading the way. So one example that just comes to mind is Voices of Youth for Chicago Education, that really pushed forward at the state level the implementation of restorative justice practices in schools, and a change to discipline statewide, but particularly here in the city of Chicago.
I was going to give the same example, like how cool is it that CTU staff, right, adults, would go to Springfield and be working with students from Voice, right, to change the law. That's powerful. And I will say a lot of that work is happening in schools. There are student voice committees at many of our Chicago public schools, which is great, but a lot of the work is happening out of the schools too, right? Groups like Asada's Daughters have been instrumental in protest movements lately, right, around the Buy Anita campaign, right, the Kim Foxx race, and other issues in the city. So we just got to empower the students in our schools more, because they have the knowledge, they know what's going on.
A couple more questions from what's being flashed on the screen here, which maybe focus on our present moment and our new mayor, Lori Lightfoot, and what the hope is for her and for her administration. A question about $2.4 million going to a development plan in Chicago. What would CPS do with that kind of money, or what could CPS do with that kind of money? And then also a question too about teachers. How do we get more Black and Latinx teachers? And what are the numbers of, what are the percentages of Black male teachers, right? And how can we get more Black men in the classroom teaching as well?
Okay, so the first one was the...
a question about what the hope might be for now with Lightfoot, and what could be done if money were funded or put towards CPS in the ways that it's put towards certain development plans in the city.
I mean, what a moment where we were choosing between two Black women candidates, right, who were purporting a progressive platform. Like, it's an exciting moment and opportunity. We also have a new governor. We're in a different place than we were 10 years ago. So I think, what I'll say is that we are looking forward, right, to the platform that Mayor Lightfoot put forward coming to fruition, and I think that's going to be the challenge. She supports trauma-informed schooling and nurses nurses and clinicians and social workers in schools. She supported an elected representative school board in the lead up to this election. So, you know, we remain open and hopeful at CTU that those things will actually come to pass. And I think what you'll see happen over time is if those things don't come to pass, right, a movement to hold accountable leaders who supported these positions that we've been fighting for a very long time. Yeah, and the money for Lincoln Yards and the 78 could have, we basically need $2 billion in our schools if we want to fully staff up. So we could have gotten a really long way to that. We could have a nurse in every school building easily, right? I think there's something like 100 and some, I can't remember exactly how much more money coming from the state, and there's a portion of that coming to Chicago Public Schools this year, so great. However, did folks hear that there were layoffs yesterday? Right?
That was one of the questions as well.
Yeah, so we're in this moment that is exciting. There's hopefully more money coming in, and yet the same policies are being enacted. Why did the school district decide that they needed to lay people off? Well, they say they do it every year, and that there's churn, and that programs change. But think about what schools are hit the hardest. It's the ones that are already struggling. The schools that have a small number of students and can barely hold on, they're gonna be the ones who had a layoff or two, but that might mean their only art teacher or their only science teacher, and then you end up, hopefully, not with another wave of school closings coming this way. Like many of us have been nervous to see if the district and the new mayor will move to close high schools now, because there are a lot of very small high schools. What if we turn those into sustainable community schools that were fully funded, fully staffed up, and helped communities understand that these are viable options? We've got a really awful dialogue in our city about good schools and bad schools that we've got to just stop. It's racist. It doesn't help anyone. If you want a school to be successful, then give it what it needs, and then empower the people in that community to do what they need to do with the resources.
You want to take up the question of teachers, and then we probably need to end on that note.
Sure. I mean, Jen just said all the things, so, and yes, all that. I do think around this issue of equity, though, right? Like, I think we need to have a real conversation in the city about what equity means and the differences between equity and equality. Those are not the same things, right? Equality would suggest that you're just giving everyone the same thing. The same thing does not right past wrongs. The same thing does not address, you know, long-standing disparities that exist. And so when we're thinking about equity, it really is about funding based on need, not funding simply based on what makes things the same across spaces. Around this question of teachers, I think that there are lots of things that could be done. Well, so one, to say, like, male teachers of color are a far smaller proportion within the teaching force. And
I call them unicorns.
Yeah, and I think
when I see them, I'm like, oh.
Yeah, I think there's a need to address that. Yeah, at the same time that I also think there's a need to talk about the way in which teaching has been treated in a particular way, and teachers have been demeaned in a particular way because it's a predominantly women-dominated field. And so that I think we can take pride in the fact that teaching has been a woman-dominated field, and particularly for women of color, even higher percentages in those communities, and talk about what it means on the flip side when we're firing Black women. And what they mean to their communities, and what it means for them to no longer be these sort of important forces on their blocks, in their churches, in their communities, that they've been for generations now because of this intensive struggle that's happened around teaching and what teaching has meant for communities. So I think those things can happen at the same time. And the other thing I'd say just about some ideas around the teaching thing. One piece that we were talking about just now is in the 60s, there was everyone in the state had to take an exam to become a certified teacher. In addition, here in the city of Chicago, you had to take an oral exam. And the oral exam was used as a way to systematically deny Black teachers in particular, in a subjective manner, certification. And so this certification issue was a major sort of point of contention and organizing. And also folks with accents, people for whom English was not their first language, et cetera. This test was used in that way, in a discriminatory fashion. Today, we have other tests that people take that the outcome has been very similar, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was just, I think, last week. Okay, that one of these tests has now been sort of put on a probationary period, or a taken away and off the table. So I think there are things around barriers to entry that need to be addressed, as well as ways that we can think about different ways to recruit. Recruiting at historically Black colleges and universities, recruiting at Hispanic serving institutions more aggressively, using programs and building up programs like Grow Your Own here in Chicago and across the nation that take folks within their communities and give them the training to teach and remain and within their communities. Also programs that train paraprofessionals to become full-time certified teachers. And I often say this too, I mean, what if Chicago Public Schools prioritized hiring their own graduates?
Yes.
Right? That's a policy that would automatically, or could, has the potential to dramatically diversify the teaching field. So I think there's lots of options and opportunities there.
That's really useful. And thank you both so much. I know you're joining us this afternoon too. Thank you.